Bienvenue tout le monde.
Welcome to the 23rd meeting of the Standing Committee on Official Languages. Pursuant to Section 1083F of the Standing Orders and the Order of Reference dated Tuesday, December 9, 2025, we continue our study of the Official Languages Regulations, progress toward equality in status and use of English and French. I would now like to welcome our witnesses. From the Canadian Francophone Women's Alliance, we have Nora Naye and Soukaina Boutiab. Executive Director, welcome. And from the Association of Colleges and University of the Canadian Francophone, we have Martin Normand, President and CEO. Welcome. Each organization will have 5 minutes to deliver their opening remarks. We will then proceed to a question and answer period with MPs. Ms. Naye, you have the floor. 5 minutes. Thank you. Chair. On behalf of the Canadian Francophone Women's Alliance, thank you for the invitation. My name is Nora Naye. I'm the president of the Alliance. I am accompanied by Soukaina Boutiab, Executive Director. The Alliance is a national feminist nonprofit organization dedicated to promoting the role and contribution of more than 1.5 million Francophone and Acadian women living in minority communities. We rely on a network of 17 member organizations from coast to coast. I would like to begin by highlighting the central role of women in language transmission, an element that is often underestimated in public language policies. Francophone and Acadian women are true pillars of official language minority communities. They play a vital role as guardians of the language and ensure the vitality of our communities. We would like to reaffirm our full support for the recommendations of the FCFA. They provide a solid and essential foundation. However, we would like to add an element that we consider essential to accurately reflect the reality of Canada's Francophone community. The OLA must not be diluted in the name of intersectionality, but rather it must be considered as complementary. These two principles must be articulated together, clearly and unambiguously. However, the current application of gender-based analysis plus, GBA plus, when conducted without a linguistic lens, weakens or even renders invisible official language minority communities. A truly intersectional perspective must be based on the OLA, not compete with it. We recognize the structuring role of GBA Plus in the development of all public policies. But when applied without considering the language dimension, it risks pitting language rights against diversity issues, when in fact, they ought to reinforce each other. Properly applied intersectionality never undermines language achievements. It consolidates and contextualizes them. It is essential to remember that Francophone women, with their multiple identities, belong first and foremost to an official language minority. This affiliation profoundly shapes their life trajectories, their access to services, and their socioeconomic conditions. Their reality, often marked by double, triple, or even greater marginalization as women, as Francophones in a minority context, and due to other identity factors, accentuates their vulnerability. It creates situations of precarious that too often remain invisible in analyses, public policies, and decision-making processes. Strong official language minority communities are, above all, communities where language rights are fully integrated into analysis and decision-making. And effective regulations are regulations that take into account the realities experienced by all women, without ever putting their identities against their language rights. Our message is clear. Intersectionality must complement the Official Languages Act, never replace or undermine it. Both must be applied together, rigorously, consistently, and in compliance with legal obligations. Because protecting our language rights is not a marginal issue. It is fundamental. It is what allows our communities to exist, to pass on their culture, and to look to the future with confidence. That is why we invite you to strengthen this regulation so that it fully reflects this reality. Let us ensure that it is clear, ambitious, and faithful to the OLA. Properly applied intersectionality protects our language rights rather than diluting them. It is on this assumed complementarity that the vitality of our community depends. Thank you for your question. We're happy to answer any questions. Thank you. Now, Mr. Normand, 5 minutes. Thank you very much. In 2005, amendments were made to the OLA, including the possibility of establishing terms and conditions for implementing Part 7. However, that same year, a lawyer from the Department of Justice expressed concern that the more details were provided in the regulations, the greater the risk of limiting the scope of Part 7. In other words, the potential for innovation was greater in the absence of regulations. The context has changed. We now have a significantly expanded Part 7, for which regulations are essential. But the warnings of the past have proven true. Our organization thinks the draft regulations for Part 7 contravene the intent of the legislator, considerably reduce its scope, and do not give federal institutions the means to act proactively toward achieving true equality between the two official languages. We will send you a more comprehensive brief shortly, which will go into greater detail about our observations and expectations. Today I'll focus on 3 concerns. First, there is a high risk that the regulations will hinder innovation in official languages. The regulations do not encourage federal institutions to develop positive measures outside the indicated parameters, meaning the specific stages in government action or when identifying the potential negative impacts of structural decisions. On the contrary, the regulatory framework ought to encourage federal institutions, for instance, to develop positive measures that are consistent with their mandate, or take a retrospective look at existing measures that do not advance official languages' true substantive equality. Rather than being a stifling feeling, the regulation must be a floor that propels us collectively toward concrete and intentional positive measure. The proposed framework is therefore too restrictive and encourages inertia rather than proactivity. Moreover, the draft proposals regarding analyses, their use in dialogue and consultation activities, and their consideration in final decisions are inadequate. The regulations do not indicate how these analyses should be carried out, nor do they specify who is responsible for producing the data to support them. Some institutions have developed good practices in this regard that could serve as benchmarks, nor is there any provision for the publication of the results of these analyses, particularly with a view to consultation. Federal institutions are only encouraged to record the results of the analysis when they ought to be made available for consultation to ensure that relevant information makes consultations effective. There is also no provision for federal institutions to report on how consultations were used in the final decision-making process. The regulations therefore deviate from best practices in citizen participation. Finally, we return to an oversight in the legislation that has long concerned us. The Act and the draft regulations have limitations that restrict the scope of federal-provincial territorial relations. The emphasis on agreements masks the diversity of interactions between levels of government. Several federal institutions have developed positive measures that have a direct impact on the post-secondary sector and Francophone minority communities. However, the law opens the door to these measures being implemented unevenly if governments refuse to collaborate with federal institutions. We had hoped that the regulations would provide guidelines for action in the event of inter-jurisdiction conflicts and establish conditions conducive to the development of measures that would have a direct and continuous impact, effectively and equitably. The regulations therefore perpetuate a restrictive view of government relations that may hinder the achievement of the objectives set by the legislator. The draft bill is undermined by ambiguities and loopholes that will weigh heavily on the ability of federal institutions to promote progress toward equal status and use of French and English, and to support the development and growth of minority Francophone communities and the strong institutions that serve them. Among these, post-secondary institutions are key in that they contribute to the achievement of federal objectives, including the opportunity for lifelong learning in French, support for essential sectors such as health, justice, and early childhood, and action to restore the demographic weight of Francophone minorities. It is for this reason that we would like to see a more robust regulation that calls for innovation. The ACUFC recommends that the Treasury Board Secretariat take note of the widespread dissatisfaction with the draft regulation reviewed in the light of the main concerns raised by all stakeholders and come back with regulations that better reflect the intentions of the legislator and set an example for consultation. Thank you very much. Questions? Mr. Gaudin, 6 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you to our witnesses for being in person. We really appreciate it. I won't talk about past experiences. Witnesses. From what I've understood, the pre-regulations do not fulfill your expectations for various reasons with different visions. Madame Enayeb, please tell me, for you, what elements would you like to review or would you like see in the regulation? You talked about intersectionality. Can you specify, and can you suggest parts that you would like to be in the regulations? Yes. And Mr. Normand, I'll ask you a similar question after. As there's GBA Plus that is already in the Act, it's to ensure that the language lens is included. Intersectionality. We're talking about Francophone women. When we say, yes, but you're part of intersectionality, you're part of diversity, they're removing the official languages element, and that's what we want. We want the language lens in GBA+. Currently, when there's intersectionality, we take identity factors into account. Practically, what we often hear by some ministers, they say we don't want to directly mention Francophone women or minority languages because we don't want to favor one group over the next. So instead of mentioning, we're going to talk about intersectionality. So it's diluted, said Mr. Gaudin. Yes. And so we're making Francophone women invisible, and we're hiding their needs. And we need that in the action plan against domestic violence, and there are negative effects, and there are no positive measures there, and women at the time being don't necessarily have the service they need. So to sum up, in the regulation, you'd like a language lens that's more specific for Francophone women so that their situation can be taken into account, which is difficult. And I don't want to say minority, but as a group, you'd like to grow and have your rights recognized. So you'll have your place. Yes, not dilute our rights, but I'd go even further to understand and make everyone understand that intersectionality doesn't mean not respecting the OLA. There's the OLA, and you need to recognize that within our communities, there are different identitarian factors around the table. There are different identities, but we're still part of the Francophone community. Yes, thank you. Mr. Normand, I listened to you this week. We heard from a professional at the University of Ottawa. I think she's a professor, Madame Cardinal. She said, we're starting all over. Well, that's what you're saying. You seem really dissatisfied with the regulation that took 3 years to write. And it doesn't respect the spirit of the law, from what I've understood. How can we fix it all? According to what you said, we need to erase it and start again. Please give us advice. I wouldn't say you have to erase it all and start again, but I'd say what we have before us is the bare minimum. We hoped that this regulation would have brought specifications that would give tools for federal institutions to take positive actions. But when I read this regulation, I see that we're codifying loopholes.
How to codify, then, the minimum respect for languages? We should be propelled towards some new horizons where we don't have to explain to a federal entity what linguistic rights are. I know that there are in some institutions walls that are built with respect to the linguistic obligation. And the roadmap shows clearly that there are ways to act, ways to go forward, which should some of them are mentioned in the regulation, but they should be improved in terms of structure. Did you give us a brief? Yes. So can I ask you this question? This innovation, that you said it breaks innovation, it slows it down. It is constraining, and it restrains. 15 seconds, sir. Well, I'll come back again to this issue because I can't say much and do much in 15 seconds. But given your representations, I understand what you're saying. And help us, please, so that we can be a better place to be efficient. Well, everything is in my brief. Thank you. Mr. Deschênes-Thériault, 6 minutes. Thank you. In your testimony, you mentioned, and this is for the Alliance des Femmes, that there are certain things that reinforce themselves. It was a general statement. Can you be more precise? And you say that you want to strengthen Part 7. That would have a beneficial effect, would it not? May I continue? There's an action plan to counter violence. So then when you say, why do you put Francophone women before other women? We have Indigenous women, Inuit women. We are definitely not in competition with any group at all. But there are laws. There is the legislation in the Official Languages Act, and it should be automatic, but it isn't. So what we want to see is a strengthening of it. Yes, but to not understand that within our communities there are needs that exist. You have women living with disabilities. They need services in French as well. And so, yes, we have the Official Languages Act, but within that act, there should be recognition of these special needs. Now, there's an action plan, and that has been put forward. But presently, there are services that don't exist in certain provinces and territories. So what we want is to see these services offered, and where women are fleeing violence, we want them to have a service offered to them in French, where they live. The Treasury Board wants a modernized act, but that would be a good example where Treasury Board could intervene to see that the obligations are fulfilled. Is that a good example? Yes, certainly. That we can't go beyond the Official Languages Act, but nonetheless, all of that has to take into account these special groups. You put forward positive measures. Yes, certainly I see positive measures, though, in the changes. There are women's organizations that lack money. Some organizations basically are surviving on volunteerism. I speak on behalf of women in the provinces and territories, but there is concrete improvement. Thank you so much. Now, Mr. Martin, this draft project that we have here for the changes in the regulations, why do you find fault with it? Education is a provincial jurisdiction, so I'm perhaps not properly informed about the federal legislation. But given that the Government of Canada seems to be moving away from its responsibility to support Francophones in certain institutions. There can be an overlap, of course, or in terms of federal and provincial jurisdictions, but you do see a conflict where there is action by the provinces and by the federal government. Just imagine a positive measure that is developed by a federal entity, but not by a provincial entity. What we need is something that would correct this loophole where communities that are disadvantaged would be able to access the tools that they need to achieve equality, if you like. That's one thing. When you talk about things that are mandatory or obligations, the need to develop positive measures with respect to, say, scientific disciplines, teaching. We have in our institutions what we need for social development that often has a very marked impact, an economic impact. But sometimes they are sheltered from government action. Well, say we move with this as how will we live with the results of the changes? How important is change to Part 7? That part should be made public with all the stakeholders being consulted so that all this relevant information is going to allow for an effective participation in terms of consultation, and there will be able to reach agreement on all sides. Is there a last recommendation that you can offer? I have many, but on the matter of these analyses that are missing, they have to be carried out. There are good practices that exist in departments, lenses that can be applied, but all of these tools can be used to work to our collective good, our goal. Mr. Beaulieu, 6 minutes. You said that you were happy with the budget, that there was an increase for equality of women and gender, but there's nothing for Francophones. Do you want us to specify in each area where there are positive measures to be taken for Francophone women? Yes, that's what we'd like to see. And we would like to see the departments develop a specific strategy to this end. There are parts missing where there are entities that are not even part of the action plan in terms of official languages. So I really believe each federal department should have a strategy. Well, can you specifically name the departments? Do you feel if they were named, that would be a help? Not just for linguistic minority situations, but for Francophones per se. Yes, I think that if they were named, there should be a strategy. They should be in it. Now, for young people attending universities, the concepts I've heard are not well defined in terms of regulations. It doesn't define specifics. with respect to the education that young people are obtaining at the university level. Do you have something to offer us with respect to that? Well, if you want my opinion, that should be in the law, in the act itself. Well, what we want to see is equality. Often I'm told when I speak to this, Martin, it's a gigantic effort to try to achieve this at the secondary level. If there is a progression, let me give you an example. The National Research Council. This is a federal institution within which there is some foot dragging in terms of taking linguistic needs in hand. So you have researchers, Francophone researchers, who are part of that committee where they feel that they can be minimized. Doing research in French, well, can I tell you what it is? No. But I do know this. Right now, the federal government and the federal institutions should provide a guide that would allow as a researcher to sit down, say tomorrow morning, and say, yes, I understand this, and I understand what is there for me under the Official Languages Act as well. That would provide a diversity of voices in research centers. Francophone research must be taken into account. Though we have to sit down with these institutes and we have to say, look, if you do this, this is going to lead to a better structure in terms of research. This type of tool is what we are speaking about, but equality in terms of Francophone access to equal services, or is there a equal quality of service that is offered to Francophones? I think it's a simplistic definition because there are not schools of mathematics in each community. Each community can define its own needs and objectives. It might be unrealistic to speak about or even imagine major generalist types of institutions that would be in each area. It requires cooperation. There's one definition, centralized, is something that could be a tool. Yeah, but if I speak to you about equality, is it real? You know, we have to be able also to adapt to a variety of realities, even though you're seeking the same goal. Yes, if it is well drafted and conceived, the community would be able to better understand what they are seeking, what their goals are, what their horizon is. What is it? Is it equality in terms of gender? Is it in terms of national defense? In terms of what's their transport? 15 seconds. You said earlier that university research is a federal responsibility. Well, the provincial governments have research funding as well. And Quebec has research funding, but there's very little research funding in other provinces. That's what sets Quebec apart. It is the federal government's responsibility is to fund research throughout Canada. But there's no provincial Francophone research fund available. There might be small envelopes in certain provinces, but it's not institutionalized everywhere. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu. Colleagues, we're going to the second round of questioning. If we have the time, we should hopefully be able to complete a full second term. Mr. Dalton, thank you. And thank you to our witnesses for being here with us, Mr. Normand. It's a real pleasure to see you here again. I remember when the act to modernize the Official Languages Act, there was an expression of joy amongst the various associations and Francophones living in a minority language situation. It gave them great hope. But now, 2 or 3 years on, we have to draft the regulations. And it's a bit of a concern, the reaction that we are hearing. You are saying, well, what's different here in the area that you represent? To your mind, do you see visible improvement, clear, concrete improvement, Mr. Normand, in what has been happening? The CUFC indicated its great disappointment with respect to the 2 bills on official languages. We did not agree with the approach that was proposed for a variety of reasons. There were jurisdictional conflicts, and we have been expressing our dissatisfaction with respect to the tabling of C13 and its counterpart. So I can tell you right now, with respect to positive measures, we have to be able to have regulations that will lead the federal government to take positive measures outside of the sites that are set out in the regulations. They have to be more proactive. Are there mechanisms, policies, and programs that exist currently that may hurt the ultimate goal? To say what exists up to today is perfect, it's working just fine, well, that blocks positive further measures. A few weeks ago, we had a final report from the Official Languages Commissioner, and one of the entities targeted in that simply refused to implement the recommendations that were made by the Commissioner. That is a problem. Thank you. And thank you also for the correction. You had concerns beforehand, you say, and we understand. Now, would you say, in your opinion, do you see this as a political document, something that the federal government would be able to say, look, see what we have done. This is something we have done. It's all well and good. You can comment on that, and then I'll ask another question. All language issues in Canada are profoundly political, and the Official Languages Act, I would not say is solely a tool for the government, but it is important that we be able to make a different choice. Thank you. Madame Meunier? Other than funding, what is the most harmful measure taken by the government with respect to women living in minority situations like that? What do you see now, today? 35 seconds, sir. People are afraid that budgets are going to be cut. The first thing that we see in a budget is, rumors abound that there will be further budget cuts. I think that is something that is of great concern. We always hear about this in terms of basic funding. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. Madame Ginette, 5 minutes.
Thank you. Lovely to have you, dear witnesses. It's wonderful to hear from you because you have solutions. You've talked about GBA Plus, and not everyone knows about Gender-Based Analysis Plus. In 2011, it was put in place for the Treasury Board so that all departments could evaluate data through a gender lens. And then there was a plus for intersectionality in 2011. And then the budget needed to look at that data. So when you talk about women's place, well, for several meetings, we have a problem with data. The data analysis machine is linked to the gender equality machine. If the lens is the issue, the language lens, but if it's the SCL, then could you use the same data analysis and do so in a way that was structured? Yes, there are both languages, men and women, etc. And so if you look at it, instead of just to not forget women, it's to look at the data analysis machine and say OLA isn't just a plus. It's not just an add-on, it's a legal obligation. So languages and intersectionality. And the process for data analysis would already be in place. Is that what you mean? Microphone, please. That's one of the solutions, that it would be automatic every time. And when we say we need tools, we would integrate that. Second, Mr. Normand, one of our witnesses referred to the OLMC framework. That emphasizes education, cultural activities, active offer, visibility, and economic and social integration. That affects multiple government departments. It doesn't impact everyone. We know very well, we've heard it from many people, that it creates dissatisfaction because it's not currently in place everywhere. If we were to keep innovation, but ensure that the base is there and that we use that framework to look at the concrete indicators, because many people are saying that they have to be concrete. There's a framework that already exists, and put that into the regulation. Would that be something constructive? And then I'll get back to innovation. My fear here is this, that we take away from certain federal institutions. Federal institutions seem the most... Okay, I'll stop you there. That's my point. Okay, we need to go... further, but that's a basis. We can get concrete data related to other things. There are a lot of pre-existing programs, but that's a massive multi-year file to review all of our programs. But we can take advantage on the data that already exist. Could we say the all-new program, like Build Canada Homes, etc.? What's really urgent is for the analysis to be done from data to see what we can do. And so those new programs will allow us to see priorities, and we can evaluate that based on data. That would allow everyone to see what must be done and not have people who are just ticking the box and improve things in the going into the future and prioritize the programs we already have based on data to see what we can do. 15 seconds, so very quick response, please. I don't agree with that approach. By only focusing on what's new, we're not looking at historical inequality of the last 20 or 30 years, and consultation and dialogue ought to be used to ID programs that should be reviewed on a priority basis. I agree. Thank you. Mr. Beaulieu, 2.5 minutes. Thank you. Mr. Normand. You said we need clear indicators on new obligations for the federal government. That is for post-secondary education. Please give us more concrete examples of a regulation that would be to your satisfaction. First, incentivize innovation with positive measures. That could have an effect on the post-secondary sector. One concrete example. Go back to the past and act on inequity in science that have been documented for the last 5 years. There's an expert group on research in French that will remind once again the recommendations that we've heard for at least 5 years. We must have the means here to tell federal institutions you must act on these recommendations. Research funds, what you're telling me outside Quebec, it's federal. So the federal government has the ability to act, but does not. That's right. There are many reports that document that structural inequality. So calling for innovation, second thing. Data analysis by federal institutions must be made public so that we have an equality of chance and of chances in consultations. It's not a level playing field. If the federal government has tons of data that the community sector does not have, that's not fair. If the federal institution, their data on the role of post-secondary educations, well, I want that data so that I can participate in those consultations and have a voice at the table on an equal basis. 30 seconds. And given your general dissatisfaction, all right, but how can we push the government to act? In my opinion, in terms of consultations, there's a plethora of best practices for citizen engagement that the TBS ought to take advantage of, review the consultations seriously, with results in mind, which we should have had under the Act. Thank you. Now, Mr. Gaudin, 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. To the witnesses from the Alliance, you talked about not diluting intersectionality. I'll take it from the other point of view. To put this concept in the regulation, wouldn't that constrain you rather than making things easier? It's not diluting intersectionality, but to dilute Francophone women within intersectionality. But for the regulation, where do we talk about intersectionality? Mentioning it clearly gives a guardrail about how intersectionality ought to be practiced in departments, because right now, for GBA Plus, intersectionality, there's no complementary approach, so the regulation would give a more solid and concrete basis for departments. So it's to protect, oh, okay, I see. In the same vein as my colleague, Ms. Chanette, to expand policies, and I'll ask Mr. Normand about this as well, to expand strategies in different departments. Earlier, you said science over the last 5 years, there's data, etc. To be honest, we can't turn back time. I'm future-focused, but in the regulation, there ought to be some specific language to oblige all departments and agencies to have that obligation, and it's up to them to provide data. That ought to be in the regulation, in my opinion. That way we'd reach our goals. So each department ought to put positive measures in place in order to help minorities, language minorities, French and English language minorities. This regulation is applicable on all federal institutions. The fact that there's no list means it's everyone, and that forces departments who perhaps never thought about official languages previously has to look at this and say, are there action plans that are relevant for communities? Example, recently in the media we saw that the federal government wants to create a Marine base in Baie-Comeau or Moncton. But creating a Marine base for national defense means what? Once Francophones get there, what does it mean for health? What does it mean for training programs, high school programs? So you can't just say that this federal institution, their structural decisions don't have effects on official languages. Some federal institutions shouldn't think that official languages is under Canadian heritage. It's not their problem. It's not under Canadian heritage. It's a TBS. They have the legal responsibility with a partnership. But federal institutions often send us to Canadian heritage, and they're not sending you to the right place. But that's because the TBS doesn't have any funding envelope. It's heritage. That's why they send us to heritage. But the TBS gives instructions to heritage. Oh, you're right, but it's not up to heritage to fund all OL official languages initiatives. No, it's the TBS who obligates all departments to take positive measures. In your presentation, you said that putting too many regulations in place would have a negative rather than positive effect. But in this case, wouldn't it be better to, because there's no obligatory dimension on all departments, wouldn't it be better to put that in the regulations? Or if we put it in, are we shooting ourselves in the foot? Because if we forget a little detail, then we'll have to fight in order to justify what we want to do. According to the applicable field, it already applies to all federal institutions. Yes, it's applicable, but it's not mentioned. The obligation of each department isn't mentioned to have a linguistic lens, 15 seconds. That's where a better consciousness of producing data on each federal department would maybe ameliorate that fear, but all departments are already aimed at by the regulation, but they're not equipped. Thank you. Madame Mingarelli, 5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Question for the Alliance. Thank you for being here. And thank you to Mr. Normand. You called for specific funding for Francophone women's organizations. Should the regulation include mechanisms on funds? At the moment, organizations carry the weight of Francophone women without funding. And in some provinces, there aren't even any women's organizations because their volunteers are burned out. There's a major crisis in the movement. And there's the rise of anti-feminism, there's gender-based violence, femicides are on the rise. There are many needs, but unfortunately, there is not adequate resources for organizations. So positive measures are measures that adequately prioritize Francophone women. Example. One organization works for women experiencing gender-based violence in BC. One person works part-time, covers BC and the Yukon, and she single-handedly runs a listening line. For 2 provinces, we have one part-time person. And that's not even talking about a women's shelter. That's just one example. Thank you. How can we avoid for Francophone organizations to be disadvantaged in pan-Canadian programs? We must develop a strategy That's a solution, in our opinion. All departments must develop strategies for linguistic minorities, and women are part of more than half of the population, but unfortunately, they're not well serviced. We need a feminist Francophone strategy for all departments to ensure that the mechanisms in place don't have a negative impact, but rather positive measures that allow Francophone women to thrive. Thank you. That's the end of my questions. Mr. Chair, I'd like to open the debate adjourned January 2nd regarding Mr. Deschênes-Thériault's subject, the subject of integrating and the integration and acceptance of Franco-queers within the Canadian Francophonie. Thank you, Madame Mingarelli. I will consult the clerk.
Merci.
Okay, so avant de donner la parole.
Before giving you the floor, what Ms. Mingarelli proposes is a dilatory motion. There's no debate. Unless, if you'd like just a clarifying question, but just a heads up. Yes. Can we have a moment or two, please?
Yeah, so Madame Mingarelli, est-ce que vous pourriez
Je vais le répéter?
I'll repeat it, yes. All right. I'd like to open the adjourned moment, December 2nd, 2025, regarding my colleague's motion about the integration and the acceptance of Franco-queers within the Canadian Francophonie.
Donc,
No debate, Mr. Godin. What I'd like to understand is that there's no debate on the motion, but we can debate the subject. Or after that, we'll talk about the motion. But we can't prevent the motion being tabled. It's a dilatory motion, but afterwards, that'll allow us to discuss the motion at the next step, which is automatic from what I understand, yes. So what Ms. Mingarelli is proposing is a dilatory motion, so we have to vote on it. She wants to reopen a debate. If it's adopted by the committee, then we'll have the debate immediately. Microphone, please. Then we'll have the debate. And the other work we do as the committees, the reports, is that going to be set aside until the committee decides to end the debate? Yes.
No, point of order is motion dilatoire.
Microphone, please. It's a dilatory motion. What I can do is I can suspend for 1 minute.
for a minute. That's what I'm saying. So I'm, yeah, just to make sure there's no misunderstanding, I'll suspend for a minute, but then we'll go right into the vote. Okay? On suspend 1 minute. la rencontre.
The meeting is back in session. We have received the dilatory motion from Madame Gallery that I will, no clarification. We move to the vote.
Président. Donc, Monsieur,
Thank you, Chair.
Oui.
Madame Chenette,
Oui.
Madame Mingarelli,
Oui.
Monsieur Villeneuve,
Oui.
Monsieur Godin,
Yes.
Monsieur
Bilingual.
Dalton,
Oui.
L'ai dit que j'étais pas contre les Anglais, moi.
Monsieur Lake, Monsieur Gill,
Yes.
Monsieur Beaulieu. D'accord. Donc, 9 pour, 0 contre.
9 in favor, 0 against. All right, we will now move to the debate on the motion. But before doing that, I would like, on behalf of the committee, to thank our witnesses. We were at the very end of your question period, of the time that you had to spend with us. So thank you again for your testimony. We apologize, but we thank you. Thank you. Colleagues, we will now resume debate on this motion. Is somebody here who would like to seek the floor? Yeah, I just want to say that this is with respect to the inclusion, with respect to federal support. That was the spirit behind the motion. That also included sexual diversity, and we thought that it might well be worth our while to look at the issue, to broaden representativity, and that was the thinking in December. But also you have to take into consideration the situation in rural areas. But what we really are seeking here is something that will be broad enough as the topic and that would allow us to provide support. So that was the thinking behind the motion that was brought in. I'm sorry. I didn't remember. I thought it had passed. There was a proposal that was led by the Bloc that said Franco-queer was very specific to one group. There was no mention of sexual diversity. At the time, we proposed other terms to have a broader sense of sexual diversity. Perhaps you can explain. Well, that was a proposal that we are making. Maybe you can explain a little bit more what you've got in mind here. May I have Mr. Godin? Well, Chair, I have no problem with doing this type of study, but before going any further, I would like to know what are the elements of what have these groups lived through? What are their experiences? All groups have lived experience to share with us. All these groups in our society can share their daily experiences. So I'm wondering if this is the right committee to do so, though. I'm thinking aloud here, because once you open a door, and I certainly meet different groups, we have a heavy schedule here. If we add this to our schedule, there may be other regulations and perhaps other commissioners that are going to leave, and new replacements will have to appear. I'm just wondering about the importance of opening up this type of debate, of this type of possibility to groups without beforehand justifying a specific need. So I'm just throwing it out there. My colleague from the Bloc wants to perhaps be more precise in the motion. I'm not against debate. I want to be constructive, but it's this a thought that I'm having. Thank you. Mr. Deschênes-Thériault, under the Act, the plurality of Francophone groups constitutes a sector, and that, to my mind, includes LGBTQ plus. So our study doesn't necessarily have the same community network that other groups have access to. These particular groups is perhaps a blind spot in the work that we have been doing up to now. I know that we have a heavy calendar, but I think that we could hear specific news about activities in terms of Franco-queer, but also the LGBTQ plus, that would allow for a perspective that would allow us to consider whether or not this is something we can undertake. And I see that it mentions not more than 3 meetings on this matter. Mr. Godin, Mr. Beaulieu, well, you could modify the vocabulary if need be, but it is not a broad study on the Francophone, on Canadian francophonie. Does it include Quebec? Of course it includes Quebec, in my mind. Mike, followed by Mario. I'll be speaking English.
I'm just curious. This is a new committee for me to fill in on today. As I'm wondering about the Canadian Francophonie and thinking about various groups that might not be represented in conversations, it seems to me that list could be very, very long. And I'm curious with the committee if there's been studies, for example, undertaken to understand communities with disabilities, of people with disabilities, for example, in this area. I was just at a meeting of the Autism Alliance of Canada in Edmonton that we helped coordinate with the Francophone community in Edmonton regarding services available in French for families or individuals with autism in the Edmonton area. Is what's specific? Maybe I just don't fully understand the mandate of the committee, but it would seem to me that virtually everything that any other committee in Parliament could study could also be studied from the minority language context in this committee. So how do we set priorities? I don't even know what it sounds like. There's a fairly busy agenda in front of this committee. What is the core priority of the committee? I would encourage, if I was a regular person on the committee here, a regular attendee, I would be ensuring that that we were pretty tightly focused on the studies that were already before us, and leaving lots of flexibility, maximum flexibility moving forward in case emerging issues arise. Again, I have a lot of experience in Parliament, 20 years experience in Parliament. The committees that have been the least functional in my mind are the ones that plan all of their studies for 2 years in advance and never leave room to adapt to something that is a pressing priority. So.
Thank you, Mr. Lake. Maintenant, j'ai Mario.
Mario? Mr. Beaulieu, you have the floor. And Mr. Deschênes-Thériault, then Mr. Godin. I agree with the principle. If Mr. LGBTQ plus communities, or people of sexual diversity, or if you can explain why it's limited to Franco-queers. Mr. de Chanterieu. Yes? Regarding what Mr. Lake mentioned, we're fairly efficient when we define our agendas and our priorities. Thank you for the suggestion, but I think our work has been well done. And this isn't changing our priorities. And we have been quite flexible when motions have been brought up. We were able to study those, and I don't see why this should be any different. Mr. Beaulieu, we would agree to changing concerning the integration acceptance of communities with the acronym to LGBTQIA+. We are open. If you would propose that modification, we're open to your amendments. Now, context. In and of itself, if there are groups that would come and say there were issues regarding their status as an OLMC, I would be very open to studying that. We studied immigration. We studied a plethora of subjects because Francophonie is all important structures, important for vitality. And there's a group of LGBT youth came to speak to me and said they had issues to discuss regarding being in rural communities. And it's in that spirit that I tabled the motion. And if we learned of other issues in other domains, well, I think as a committee we would be happy to study it. And I think that it's up to the discretion of each committee to decide what in the diversity of subjects they can study. And certainly at the moment there is a rise in discourse that is less open, a rise in discourse that is more critical towards these communities, and I think we need to reaffirm inclusion on our behalf. I think it would be a relevant subject for our committee. Mr. Beaulieu, if you have any changes, we're open to them. Thank you. I have a list. Mr. Godin, Madame Mingarelli, and then Mr. Beaulieu. Mr. Godin. Thank you, Chair. As I said earlier, I'm not necessarily closed to this study. My colleague's argument that those groups aren't visible enough, I don't necessarily agree. It's not the committee's mandate to give them visibility. We need to stick to the main subject, which is the official languages. Earlier, we heard the Women's Alliance. I don't want to defavor that group, but I'm more aware of those reality that Francophone women are experiencing, and I would be more apt to do a study on their experience rather than Franco-queers because I don't know their experience. If you could give me information to tell me, here's a specific case of Franco-queers, they were victim of X, Y, Z, then I would be more apt to support it, but I don't have any facts, and it's difficult for me to take a position. If ever there's a consensus, well, I'll come around. We've already generally always worked by consensus, but I would prioritize Francophone women before Franco-queers. But I have nothing against Franco-queers. I don't know them. Thank you. Madame Mingarelli. Thank you, Chair.
Mr. Lake's, what I think is a very good idea. So I would actually, further to this conversation about MP de Chanterieu's motion, which I think is very good and I would like to pursue, I would also like to suggest that we consider a brief study on how people with disabilities, especially students in school, are supported in learning French. I think that must be a serious issue across Canada. and not something that I think is very actively discussed. If people are open to that, then I would be happy to work on a motion with my team. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Madame Miccarelli. Monsieur Beaulieu.
Mr. Beaulieu. So for the amendment, just replace Franco-queer with 2 LGBTQIA+. IA+, the most inclusive possible. I can send that to you, or do you have it? You have it? If I have it right, there are many different ways to call it. Well, the person with the most inclusive term, send it to the clerk. So you're proposing an amendment. Just a moment, colleagues.
Okay. Monsieur Beaulieu, vous avez proposé. Ok. Ok. So vous avez proposé un amendement.
You have proposed an amendment, colleagues. We'll make it even more inclusive. Yes. Change it in the first and the second paragraph. Now, we're on Mr. Beaulieu's amendment. I had a list.
I believe Mr. Beaulieu suggested that, hey, just the most inclusive and leaving it up to the chair or the clerk, I guess, to get that. I don't think that it's up to the chair or the clerk to figure out the language to make sure it's most inclusive. It has to come from the committee. You know, everybody's interpretation of what the most inclusive language is going to be different. And so perhaps the mover of the motion could make the suggestion as to the letters in the particular order, letters, numbers, symbols, whatever it might be, in the particular order, because it is a sensitive thing. If we're going to try and get this right, we've got to, you know, it's going to be up to either the amender or the mover of the motion to get it right, not to the clerk.
So thank you for that. So that's on the point of order. So I'm of the view that I agree with you, Mr. Lake. That from a procedural perspective, I agree. That's the way I was planning to handle it anyway. I wouldn't dare to assume that I understand what the intentions are of all the members. So we have an amendment proposed by Monsieur Beaulieu. We have language that has been communicated to the clerk. Can we? C'est ça. Je juste dire.
I was just going to say, I'm going to ask the clerk to circulate the amendment, and that way we can, so the clerk will do that immediately. Now, Mr. Villeneuve, Madame Schnetz, you were on the list, but now, because we're on an amendment, there's a new debate. Would anyone like to speak to the amendment? Madame Schnetz. I've been influenced by the discussion we just had, by our witnesses who talked about intersectionality. Intersectionality with the Canadian Francophonie and our two official languages, the famous plus. When we conduct an analysis, we have to look at the intersection of the analyses, the intersection of vulnerable groups who have perhaps fewer services. I am hearing us talk about queer, the acronym that was mentioned, and now people with disabilities. The plus, the GBA plus includes all that, the plus, this intersectionality of different groups. if we dig a bit deeper to avoid having a series of interviews with different focuses, should the committee perhaps invite witnesses with the relevant acronym to ask them about intersectionality of those different groups? So they can put LGBTQ plus, people with disabilities, and organizations. And what we're aiming at, well, do we have to do a deep dive? Well, we have to understand their reality. And how are we going to take that into account in order to apply that at the TBS? So to take, yes, women's realities into account, I agree with Mr. Godin. There's a lot of data, there's a lot to be done, but I'm also hearing from the community to say, yes, but groups at the moment are very vulnerable, and how are we going to take that into account? And in the rest of Canada, I imagine it's similar. This is my suggestion. Intersectionality with the different groups to ensure that the Francophonie is properly examined. Before Mr. Godin, is that a sub-amendment? I'd just like to bring up the discussion, just to clarify. All right, Mr. Godin. I knew that we agreed, you and I, Madame Chenette, that we were going to agree. Here I have the definition of intersectionality. Before going further, what I mentioned earlier, we cannot choose one group that doesn't have enough visibility. We have to be inclusive. Women, who are a big group, it shouldn't be a minority, but unfortunately, society, even if they've made a big step forward, they still have room to be equal. Now, I'd add the idea of offering visibility to groups that often aren't heard. That's an opportunity to group together in this study or increase the number of meetings to ensure that we're basing our groups on gender, on race, on class, on age, on disability status, and sexual orientation. I think this is a wonderful opportunity initiated by my colleague, MP de Chantariou. We can move forward with that and see how we can move forward the cause of our minorities. And that would more justify integrating that into this committee and doing a report on it. Then we'd hear from all the different parties. And then we could list the witnesses and send it over to the clerk and decide on the meetings if we want to categorize the group so that there's an equal amount of visibility. Madame Chenette, you brought something interesting up, and I'd like to second what she said. It's not an amendment, it's an open discussion, a constructive discussion that goes from that sprung out of my colleague's initiative. Thank you, Mr. Beaulieu, then Madame Mingerelli. Maybe not enlarge the scope too much. I'd just like to specify my amendment. It's to LGBTQIA+. That's what it is. According to A+, but not according to the federal website that you sent me.
Ouais, mais c'est pas là, mais c'est ce que tu m'avais envoyé.
That's what you sent me. There was no A, but I looked at the website. So that's what I'd put. And that's pretty much everything that's not heterosexual without being reductive. That's about it. Now I'll ask the clerk to circulate that language. by email. Mr. Beaulieu, are you... All right. In the first and the second paragraph, if we can just suspend for a moment to discuss the amendment before voting? Yes.
Non, mon limité à ça.
de la suspension.
Welcome back. Madame Ngarali had the floor. Do you have anything else to add? No? Mr. Gaudin. Well, Chair, given the circumstances, because we have a very tight time frame in terms of the regulations and the monetary sanctions, I think that I should perhaps postpone this discussion, and I think people would agree that we could postpone the debate to a later date. And I guess the term is adjourn the debate. Is it really adjourn the debate? Am I using the right word? Yes. It's a dilatory motion. We have to vote on. This is a dilatory motion, so we will have to move to a vote.
Oui.
Madame Chenette?
Oui.
Madame Mingarelli?
Oui.
Monsieur Villeneuve?
Oui.
Monsieur Godin?
Oui.
Monsieur Dalton?
Oui.
Mr. Gill? Mr. Lake? Monsieur Beaulieu? Monsieur Beaulieu? 9 pour, 0 contre.
9 in favor, 0 against. The motion is adopted. Colleagues, we have perhaps 12 minutes left in our meeting. The next subject on our committee it was the drafting of the report on the monetary policies. So this is to be done. This is to be done in camera, but it will take 3 minutes to transition into in camera. Mr. Dalton? It's 5:30. I'm very aware of the time. I'm very aware. 3 minutes suspension, and then we will begin yet again.